Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. On the operating table in Lagos, the light above hung like a small sun that refused to blink, and my eyes kept watering, as if they were the only things brave enough to speak. A monitor ticked softly like a careful drummer, and the room smelled of antiseptic with a squeeze of lemon, the kind of clean that burns the nose and calms the mind at the same time. A dark-skinned nurse with gentle eyes rested her warm hand on my wrist and said, "Talk to me, my dear." "Who are you?" Her voice flowed like cool water on a hot afternoon, steady, patient, giving me space to breathe. I could hear quiet footsteps outside, rubber soles whispering across polished tiles, and beyond the hospital, I imagined Danfo horns and hawkers' calls rolling through the streets like familiar music. The gown scratched my skin, the paper cap sat funny on my hair, and still I lay there like a sealed letter waiting for someone else to decide when to read it. Fear tasted bitter as cola nut at the back of my tongue, and I swallowed, then swallowed again, as if my throat could hide it better than my face. "I'm Toria," I said, though it felt like I was borrowing the name from a past that was simpler, softer, easier to carry. The ceiling tiles lined up in obedient squares, and the air conditioner hummed like a tired hymn, and the nurse held my gaze as if she had all the time in the world. Somewhere a trolley wheel squeaked, then quieted, like a thought that changed its mind. I told myself to keep breathing, to follow the beep, to hold on to the steadiness of that tiny machine. The anesthetist checked a line, and gave me a nod that felt like permission to be human. I shifted my fingers, folded them again on my belly, and felt my heart thumping like a visitor knocking at a door I hadn't decided to open. The nurse asked what I loved, and the question sat on my chest like a small bird learning the wind. I searched for words that belonged to me, not borrowed from anyone's expectations, and I felt the room wait kindly for my answer. I told her about Surulere mornings, where daybreak arrives with the smell of warm bread and wet pavement, and the street below my balcony stretches its arms before sunlight remembers its duties. I spoke of Madame Fola's bakery downstairs, where dough meets wood with a steady thud that keeps time better than any clock, and of Akin the apprentice, who grins with flour on his cheek like a warrior's mark. I said I like leaning on the railing with a steaming cup, watching pigeons quarrel over crumbs as if each crumb contained a crown, and listening to early vendors greeting the day with voices that sound like hope rehearsed. A child in a blue uniform always runs late. A boy bangs a generator awake. A radio spills highlife from a window with a torn mosquito net, and the street answers in layered replies. I told her I live above noise that knows my name, and somehow it cradles me. I mentioned the bookshop in Yaba where I work, owned by Mama Kofo, whose table always holds a chipped mug, a small radio, and a bowl of groundnuts she rarely eats. When rain slaps the zinc roof, people wander in smelling of damp cotton and stories, and I stack paperbacks carefully, their spines like little doorways standing in rows. I said I like quiet that isn't empty, the kind where pages turn, where a pencil scrapes, where someone laughs softly because a sentence finally found them. I described my mother in Port Harcourt, her laugh bright as fresh peppers, and my aunties scattered like seeds across cities whose names fit in my mouth like prayers. I admitted I never learned to run after the loudest things. I prefer pathways that notice my footsteps and don't rush me. The nurse listened with that Lagos patience that lives beside hurry and still manages tenderness. As I spoke, the beeping became less frightening, as if my voice had found a rope to hold. I realized the street I love, the shop I love, the bread I love, were not small things. They were the floor of my life, and without them, I would float away. She asked what else was mine, and I surprised myself by saying maps. Not the smooth kind on a glowing screen, but paper maps that fold and crease and remember every hand that held them. I told her I liked the way the lagoon curves on a page like a cat asleep, and how Surulere, Yaba, Ojalegba, and the bridge between them look like stitched cloth when you step back. I said I love markets where the prices are songs and bargaining is dance, and I love buying the wrong thing because a story caught me. I told her I love road dust that settles lightly on shoe leather, and plantain that refuses to pretend it is anything other than plantain, and hymns that end with a long quiet where the heart completes the verse. I confessed I keep a small notebook of sounds, dough hitting the board, a bell over a door, two girls laughing into a scarf, a trotro driver from another country greeting our city like an old friend. I said my heart rests when no one measures it, when it stands uncounted like rain in an old bucket. Saying that startled me, because I had not planned to be so clear. The nurse's thumb pressed gently where my pulse drummed, as if to say, I hear you. A shadow of a thought moved through me, quick, fearful, stubborn, like a gecko behind a curtain. I felt it but let it pass. I wasn't ready to name it. The air conditioner sighed, the light hummed, and my breath learned the room's rhythm. The nurse asked no more questions for a while, which felt like a gift wrapped in silence. I imagined the smell of bakery sugar and pigeons pecking the last crumb, and Mama Kofo saying, "Return the book to where its family is," and I smiled at the ceiling without meaning to. My hands stopped shaking. Words sat neatly in me like folded fabric waiting for the right occasion. At last, the subject I had been circling arrived on its own feet, and I didn't chase it away. I said I am engaged, and the word felt like a wedding card placed on a table you haven't decided to sit at. His name is George, and he is handsome, certain, always tidy, the kind of man who walks like doors will open before his knuckles ever reach them. He brought coffees to the shop, asked about my back when I lifted boxes, told stories that wore fine clothes, and smiled at guards in a way that made them stand taller. He likes smooth things, plans without wrinkles, photos without shadows, words without stutters, futures without detours. He calls me sweet names and means them most days. He thinks of ease and says we, and I used to enjoy how his voice paved the road ahead. He once tapped the bridge of my nose lightly and said, "Only if you want it," and placed links and diagrams like petals, and his patience behaved like kindness. The changes he suggested came like drizzle, never storms, yet drizzle still soaks you if you walk long enough. I don't know when I started carrying his mirror for him. I don't know when I began standing only in the angles he approved. I don't know why my heartbeat waits for his nod before it runs. The nurse watched me carefully, not as if I were fragile glass, but as if I were someone worth listening to. I considered telling her everything, even the sentence I overheard that now sits like a pebble inside my shoe, but the theater lights shone hard and steady, and my courage was awake but not yet walking. I said instead that love should let a person breathe, and my voice shook, and the beeping steadied me again. The nurse nodded slowly, and for a moment I felt the city, the bakery, the bookshop, the balcony, the pigeons, and my grandmother's proverb gather themselves around my bed like family. I let the memory of warm bread rise through the cold air, and I held it, soft and sure, inside my chest. When I think of the life that shaped me before George's shadow stretched over it, I remember Suralere as a place where mornings arrived not with alarm clocks, but with noise that belonged to the street itself. My childhood stretched on that soil like fabric laid under the sun to dry. I was born in a small flat painted yellow once, now faded into a color the neighbors used to tease as old butter. My father was a post office clerk, the kind who pressed his shirts with extra care even when the iron burned a bit of fabric. My mother sold pepper in small baskets, her hands always carrying the perfume of tomatoes no matter how many times she washed them. Life was not grand, but it was steady. The first stories I ever loved were told not from books but from voices. My grandmother's tongue had a way of turning ordinary evenings into firesides, even when no flame was lit. She would say, "A girl is not clay to be shaped by every hand that touches her," though at the time, I laughed because her eyes always twinkled when she scolded. I didn't know those words would one day cling to me like wet clothes. Suralere was not quiet, but inside me I learned quiet. The bakery downstairs provided rhythm, the vendors outside gave melody, and I learned to treasure stillness like others treasure gold. In school, I was the child who drew maps instead of doodles, who stood by windows while classmates played. I remember losing a race at interhouse sports and not crying. Instead, I picked dust from my socks and thought of how the track curled like a question mark. Life moved slowly then, full of its own pauses, full of its own little floods and droughts. When my father died of an illness we never learned the full name of, I discovered grief is not always a river. Sometimes it is a stone that simply sits where your stomach used to be light. Mother worked harder, her back bending like the reed mats we sat on, but she never let the roof fall. I learned how to help with customers, how to smile at strangers while thinking of other things. These small lessons became my spine. By the time I grew, Suralere had taught me how to love simplicity without shame. It had taught me that peace is not given, it is gathered. And when George appeared, with his polished shoes and plans that spoke louder than rain on a zinc roof, I thought perhaps the life I carried like a basket on my head was finally going to be lightened. I was wrong, but the heart does not see with both eyes open at first. Meeting George was like watching Lagos rain fall on a day you forgot your umbrella. At first, it felt inconvenient, then thrilling, and before long, you wanted it to wash you clean. He came into my orbit like a man sure of his path, shoulders squared as if no door had ever denied him entry. The first days were full of small kindnesses. He knew the names of servers at cafes, greeted guards at gates with handshakes that seemed genuine, and told me I deserved more than what the world gave me. No one had ever said that with such certainty, so I believed him the way a thirsty plant believes the first rain of the season. He began with small gifts, a scarf in my favorite shade, a bracelet that dangled gently but caught the sun, and he listened when I spoke of books, even if sometimes his eyes wandered to his phone. Our walks stretched through Yaba streets where traffic horns sang their endless chorus, and he never once complained about the dust clinging to his shoes. "You should see Victoria Island at night," he said once, pointing to a sky cut by cranes and glass towers. "That's where we belong." I nodded, imagining towers instead of bakery smoke, imagining nights lit by neon instead of kerosene lamps. He invited me into a rhythm faster than my own, dinners with colleagues where laughter sounded like competition, drives across Third Mainland Bridge where he played music loud enough to make my pulse keep time. I was dazzled because he moved with the ease of someone who believed Lagos owed him space, and space bent to him. I remember thinking of my mother's proverb, "Not every loud bird owns the tree it sings on," but I tucked it away because love, in its early days, demands silence of caution. He spoke of a wedding as if it were already a sealed deal, showing me pictures of venues in Lekki, whispering how he could already see me walking down an aisle lined with roses. Each word he spoke was a brush painting a future I was too shy to imagine before. When he held me, I thought of home as something that could be expanded, and when he kissed me, I thought of life as something that could be designed. The truth is, I mistook his certainty for stability. I mistook his ambition for devotion. And in those nights when we walked back to my flat above the bakery, where flour dust sometimes escaped through windows, I thought of how he smiled despite the powder on his trousers. He seemed to fit everywhere, even in my narrow street, and I thought to myself, perhaps the universe had finally decided to give me more than bread and books. It did not happen suddenly, the way he started shaping the edges of me. It began like drizzle, the kind Lagos throws when you are just far enough from shelter to be annoyed but not drenched. One evening, while watching me tie my scarf, he said, "You would look even more graceful in brighter colors, let's try orange." Another day, after taking photos at a small gathering, he smiled at the images and said, "This side flatters you more, we should stick to that." His tone was light, his words tender, but the seed of change was planted. He carried himself like someone who had seen the final picture of our lives, and was guiding me toward it step by step. He brought brochures of clinics the way others bring chocolates, and he spoke about breathing better, sleeping better, looking brighter in the morning light. He said it like prayer requests, gentle but persistent. I did not realize when I began to see myself through his descriptions. In the market, when I bargained for plantains, I thought of how my smile might look in photos. When I shelved books, I thought of the dust making my skin less radiant. Slowly, I turned his observations into my own mirror. His world was sharp, shiny, and measured. Mine was soft, slow, and forgiving. I let myself be pulled. He loved order. I began to love it too, folding clothes twice as neatly, cooking meals that looked like plates in magazines, answering him with rehearsed ease. When he spoke of friends, he called me his perfect match, and the words glittered even as they cut. Lagos is full of noise, but in his presence, I silenced the parts of me that were inconvenient. He introduced me to colleagues who looked me over as if checking the finish on a new car. I laughed at jokes that did not land in my chest, and I let his hands guide me like chalk on a board. It was not force, it was suggestion, and yet suggestion has a way of wrapping itself like vines around a wall until the wall cannot breathe. I was happy, yes, but happiness can sometimes be a mask. It smiles while the heart wonders whose reflection it is wearing. And in those months, I learned to wear his reflection without complaint. By the time the date of our wedding was fixed in conversations, though not yet announced, the city seemed to lean toward him and not me. Friends congratulated me, as if I had been plucked from obscurity into light, and sometimes I felt like an ornament displayed in glass. My evenings changed. Instead of reading on my sofa, I spent them answering questions about colors, table settings, and whether my dress would be modest or bold. George spoke of honeymoons in Zanzibar, of photos that would prove our union was not just love but achievement. I found myself caught between two worlds, the one of my mother's voice, simple and grounded, and the one George painted flawless and polished. Lagos outside did not change. Hawkers still chased cars with sachets of water. Children still shouted in compounds. Generators still coughed at night. But inside me, a storm gathered, because every step toward that wedding felt like a step away from the girl who once stood on a balcony smiling at pigeons fighting over crumbs. I told myself this was normal, that marriage was meant to be an exchange, that compromise was the fabric of love. And yet, as the date of my surgery approached, the knot in my stomach grew tighter, like jelly wrapped too firmly around the head. I smiled when George spoke of photographers, but my smiles were worn like masks sewn quickly for a masquerade dance. The bakery downstairs still pounded dough at dawn, steady as a drumbeat, reminding me that some rhythms do not change. But my heart beat against its own walls, whispering, "Is this the home you wanted?" I carried that question in silence, waiting for the day when silence itself would no longer protect me. When I think of the life that shaped me before George's shadow stretched over it, I remember Suralere as a place where mornings arrived not with alarm clocks, but with noise that belonged to the street itself. My childhood stretched on that soil like fabric laid under the sun to dry. I was born in a small flat painted yellow once, now faded into a color the neighbors used to tease as old butter. My father was a post office clerk, the kind who pressed his shirts with extra care even when the iron burned a bit of fabric. My mother sold pepper in small baskets, her hands always carrying the perfume of tomatoes no matter how many times she washed them. Life was not grand, but it was steady. The first stories I ever loved were told not from books but from voices. My grandmother's tongue had a way of turning ordinary evenings into firesides even when no flame was lit. She would say, "A girl is not clay to be shaped by every hand that touches her," though at the time I laughed because her eyes always twinkled when she scolded. I didn't know those words would one day cling to me like wet clothes. Suralere was not quiet, but inside me I learned quiet. The bakery downstairs provided rhythm, the vendors outside gave melody, and I learned to treasure stillness like others treasure gold. In school, I was the child who drew maps instead of doodles, who stood by windows while classmates played. I remember losing a race at inter-house sports and not crying. Instead, I picked dust from my socks and thought of how the track curled like a question mark. Life moved slowly then, full of its own pauses, full of its own little floods and droughts. When my father died of an illness we never learned the full name of, I discovered grief is not always a river. Sometimes it is a stone that simply sits where your stomach used to be light. Mother worked harder, her back bending like the reed mats we sat on, but she never let the roof fall. I learned how to help with customers, how to smile at strangers while thinking of other things. These small lessons became my spine. By the time I grew, Suralere had taught me how to love simplicity without shame. It had taught me that peace is not given, it is gathered. And when George appeared, with his polished shoes and plans that spoke louder than rain on a zinc roof, I thought perhaps the life I carried like a basket on my head was finally going to be lightened. I was wrong, but the heart does not see with both eyes open at first. That night in bed, George curled around me with easy intimacy, his breath warm against my neck, his hand heavy on my waist. "Soon, babe," he murmured, his voice soft. "You'll feel so much better. We'll both breathe easier." I nodded, but inside me something had cracked, a hairline fracture invisible to the eye but widening with every word. My eyes stayed open in the dark, staring at the ceiling that bore the faint shadow of streetlight slipping through the curtains. My body lay still under his embrace, but my mind wandered restlessly. Outside, Lagos was alive. A generator coughed itself awake, a baby wailed 2 compounds away, and a dog barked at shadows it couldn't name. The city never slept, and that night neither did I. My mind replayed the sentence again and again. Easier for me to be around. Was that what love meant? Not joy, not comfort, not the soft folding of one soul into another, but convenience? I thought of my grandmother's voice, warning against being shaped by every hand, and I realized I had ignored her wisdom. I pressed my palm against my chest, feeling the rise and fall of breath, steady but tight, and wondered if my body knew the truth before my heart admitted it. George shifted in his sleep, muttering something I couldn't catch, his arm tightening around me, as if even in dreams he wanted possession. I shut my eyes, but all I saw were images of myself as an advertisement, my face stamped on glossy paper, a slogan beneath declaring perfection. I felt sick. I wanted to sit up, to drink water, to pace the floor until my feet remembered themselves, but I stayed still, as if movement might wake him, as if waking him would force me into words I wasn't ready to speak. So I lay there, silent, carrying the weight of unspoken truth. Morning came eventually, as it always does, with the bakery downstairs pounding dough, with children shouting on their way to school, with the light stretching long fingers across the room. George rose quickly, already reaching for his phone, already talking about plans. He kissed my forehead as though stamping approval, and left the room with his usual certainty. I remained at the window, staring down at pigeons pecking at crumbs, each bird messy, noisy, unshaped, and entirely itself. The days afterward carried me like a reluctant passenger in a bus going the wrong way. George brimmed with more energy than ever, speaking constantly of arrangements, of photographers, of how his friends said we were the perfect pair. He carried his phone everywhere, its screen glowing with messages I sometimes glimpsed, words like campaign, branding, timeline. Each time he said we, my heart flinched, because I no longer knew if I was part of that we, or merely a tool to achieve it. At the bookshop, I tried to lose myself in the rhythm of shelving, in the familiar smell of dust and old paper, but the weight in my chest followed me everywhere. Mama Kofo noticed. She asked once, her eyes soft but sharp, "My dear, are you eating well?" I smiled and nodded, because what else could I say? That I was starving not for food but for honesty, for a love that didn't make me smaller? Customers came and went, buying romance novels, history books, school supplies, and I wondered how many of them walked home to partners who saw them, truly saw them. At night, George picked me up, guiding me into his car with a hand at my back, a gesture that looked gentle but felt like steering. Traffic snarled around us, horns blared. Hawkers knocked at the windows selling plantain chips and phone chargers, but inside the car, silence pressed heavy on me. I wanted to ask him the question that clawed at my throat. Am I your partner or your project? But each time I opened my mouth, the words died like matches snuffed by wind. Instead, I nodded at his stories, laughed at his jokes, played the role he had written. And every night, I stood in front of the cracked mirror, washing my face slowly, staring into eyes that looked more and more like strangers. I whispered small prayers, not for miracles, but for clarity, for the strength to choose myself before I disappeared entirely. Clarity never came quickly. It is like Lagos rain. You know it will arrive, but you never know the hour, and sometimes it floods when you least expect. The closer the surgery drew, the louder the knot in my stomach grew, though I kept my face calm so no one could see. George spoke of after, as though it were already here, painting pictures of photos glowing with admiration, captions that would prove perfection, stories others would envy. He was rehearsing a future, and I was watching a performance I no longer believed in. I sat through dinners where his colleagues praised his certainty, nodding like spectators who didn't realize the actor beside him was crumbling inside. At home, I packed and repacked small bags in my mind, though my hands never touched the suitcase. Nights stretched long, filled with restless dreams. Sometimes I dreamed of running through Balagan Market where every stall sold my face, each one altered slightly, different nose, different cheeks, different smiles, none of them mine. I woke drenched in sweat, his arm across me like a lock, and I lay listening to the city hum beyond the window, wondering how to unlock myself without breaking. Morning after morning, I drank tea that went cold before I finished, staring at pigeons who fought noisily and carelessly for crumbs, birds who made no apology for their mess. They lived without editing themselves, without permission, without polish. I envied them. Silence no longer felt like safety, it felt like chains. I knew soon, very soon, words would burst from me, words sharp enough to change everything. I just didn't yet know whether I would speak them in whispers or in shouts, whether the world would hear me or not. But I knew they were coming, and I knew once they arrived, nothing, not George, not his friends, not his campaigns, would be able to put them back inside. The morning opened like a lid lifted gently off a pot, steam from last night's rain still hanging above Surelire, as if the sky had been cooking all night. I woke before the alarm, before the bakery's first thud, and moved through the flat quietly, the floor cool under my feet, the walls holding their breath. George slept with his face turned to the window, his phone face down on the table, its little light winking whenever a new message arrived. When he stirred, he dressed in quick, efficient motions, the kind you learn from meetings and flights and calendars that never show rest. We stepped outside to a city rinsed clean. Puddles gathered in potholes like small mirrors, vendors shook water from tarps, and a boy in a jersey kicked a ball that splashed every time it touched the ground. In the car, the wipers performed their steady sweep, and we drove through the wet smell of Lagos, exhaust, charcoal smoke, fried akara, damp dust, each scent making a case for its importance. At Ojalegbo we slowed to a crawl, engines growling like caged animals, horn replies bouncing from bus to bus. George muttered about timing, about how traffic didn't respect urgency. I watched a woman balance a tray of oranges, her steps sure, her head high, and envied the quiet decision in her posture. When the clinic finally rose before us, all glass and sharp edges, it reflected our shapes and slick panes. His shoulders hard, my figure small inside a borrowed calm. The lobby was colder than the morning air we'd left, the brightness too clean to belong to a city that loves dust. A receptionist smiled with practiced warmth and slid forms across the desk. Her pen tapped beside my name, as if it were impatient for ink. George signed where someone pointed, quick strokes that looked like ownership. I took my clipboard, sat on a chair that squeaked, and stared at questions that made my own face feel like a project summary. When my name was called, a nurse with a gentle mouth and tired eyes, Chinyer, her badge red, led me down a corridor that smelled like new paint and something sharper underneath. "You're in good hands," she said, and her voice did not try to sell me anything. I believed her, but my stomach tightened like a rope made for lifting something heavy. The door's side opened to a small room with a narrow bed and a machine whose soft hum set the rhythm for my breathing. I folded my hands like a person saying a private prayer and waited for my courage to choose a side. Chinyer checked my pulse and asked me to tell her about home, and the question opened a window inside me. Words came slowly, but they came. Dough on wood, pigeons on the rail, Mama Kofo's radio whispering a song older than the shop. As I spoke, the air seemed less thin. She smiled with her eyes, not her lips, and set the clipboard down to tuck the blanket smooth, the kind gesture that nurses learn from watching women calm frightened children. When she lifted the top page of the consent packet, her forehead creased, the lines deepening like a map you study just before a long walk. "These extras," she murmured, pointing neatly. "Small sculpt here, filler there, a photography release with a logo I didn't recognize printed faintly in the corner." The words sat there in black ink, unblinking. My signature appeared below, perfect, familiar, betraying me with its neatness. Memory jolted. Forms passed across tables while George joked with the receptionist, my pen obedient, my mind a few steps behind. Now the additions stared back like strangers who had found a seat at my family table. "Did you ask for all this?" Chinyer's voice was soft but firm, the tone aunties use when they have decided a child should hear the truth even if it stings. I shook my head, more breath than motion. "You can refuse," she said quietly, eyes steady on mine. "Even now." The doctor entered with a clipboard of his own, his expression neutral, his explanation precise. Outcomes, timelines, little risks in clean language. He looked at me, not unkindly, but in the way people look at a task they are very good at completing. I nodded at all the places instinct told me to nod, and felt smaller with each one. George stepped in behind him, a smile already arranged on his face, enthusiasm folded neatly around impatience. He took my hand and said our favorite word, "We," as if it were a key that could open any locked door. My throat tightened. The machine kept humming, innocent as a lullaby. Chinyer did not remove her hand from the clipboard. She waited as if the next thing should come from me. The white of the room pressed closer. The ceiling lights became a plain, bright question. I tried to breathe the way I'd practiced, in and out like the lagoon's gentle pull, and for a moment I could smell Suralere again. Wet pavement, hot bread, the street rehearsing its morning song, and the scent of it lifted something heavy inside my ribs. The pen lay on the tray, simple, patient, ready for whichever story I would choose to write. "Stop," I said, and the word landed in the room like a small stone that knows it is heavy enough. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but nothing else could happen until the circles spread from where it fell. The doctor paused, pen mid-air, then let it rest against the clipboard without comment. Good professionals know when to move forward and when to step back. His silence showed he had learned that lesson long ago. George's smile cracked at the edges. He leaned forward, voice low but charged, like a cable humming through a wall. "You're just anxious," he said. "This is normal. We talked about this 100 times. Let's not make a scene." Chinyer straightened, her shoulders a quiet barrier. "She has chosen," she said evenly. "We won't proceed." The room changed shape around those words. The walls stood a little farther apart. The air entered my lungs more willingly. "Babe," George tried again, softer now, bargaining. "Think about after. Think about how good you'll feel, how good we'll look together. Think about our plans." Plans, I thought. Always the calendar, never the clock in my chest. I reached for the blanket, pulled it higher, let my fingers find their steadiness in the fabric's rough weave. "I'm thinking about now. I answered, still barely above a whisper, but a whisper that didn't ask permission. His lids fluttered, then his gaze flicked toward the doctor as if authority might change its mind if he asked politely enough. It didn't. The anesthetist busied himself with putting things away, the orderly method of someone trained to reverse a room without bruising anyone's pride. Chinyer's hand found mine once more and gave it a small squeeze that said, "Walk if you want to. We will match your pace." I swung my legs over the side of the bed, surprised by how solid the floor felt under my feet. Shoes back on, paper cap removed, gown exchanged for the dress folded over the chair, each action a step back toward myself. George stood to the side, the storm behind his eyes gathering, then breaking, then trying again to look like rain everyone could handle. "We had everything lined up," he said, as if logistics could substitute for consent. "We had people waiting." I wanted to ask him who the we had been all this time. I didn't bother. The door opened, the corridor welcomed the small procession of our undoing, and we walked out. Not quickly, not triumphantly, just correctly. It was a quiet morning, when everything finally shifted for good. The sun was just beginning to stretch across the rooftops, gold threading through the damp air. I woke before George, his arm heavy across me, his breathing steady with sleep. Carefully, I slid out of bed and sat by the window, my knees pulled to my chest, watching as the bakery boys downstairs carried trays of bread, their laughter drifting upward like a song. The smell of fresh dough rose to meet me, warm, comforting, familiar. For the first time in months, I felt something in me unclench. When George stirred and called my name, his voice soft and uncertain, I didn't answer immediately. I rose slowly, crossed the room, and took the small box from the table. Opening it, I stared at the ring inside, its shine still perfect, untouched in a way love could never be. When I placed it back down between us, my hands were steady. "I'm not giving up on us," I said quietly. "I'm choosing myself." His eyes widened, first with anger, then with something like sorrow, but I didn't wait to see which mask he would settle on. I packed my small bag with calm hands, folding clothes neatly, sliding shoes inside, not rushing. He watched in silence, perhaps realizing words had no place here anymore. By the time I stepped out into the street, bag over my shoulder, the air was alive with noise, horns, vendors, children racing, and instead of drowning me, it lifted me. The scent of bread clung to the morning, pigeons flapped noisily above, and Lagos embraced me with her familiar chaos. For the first time in a long while, I walked lighter, carrying only myself, and it was enough. When we left the clinic, the sky was already heavy with late afternoon clouds, their bellies dark like the warning of a storm yet to fall. George walked fast ahead of me, his shoes striking the tiled floor with short, angry clicks, while I followed more slowly, my steps deliberate, as though the ground itself needed to feel each footfall to prove I still existed. Outside, the air was damp and restless, the smell of Lagos after rain thick with exhaust fumes and roasted corn from a woman crouched by a small fire near the gate. George unlocked the car with sharp motions, the remote beeping like an impatient bird. I slipped into the passenger seat and closed the door quietly, my silence a shield between us. He started the engine, but instead of driving, he sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, the leather creaking faintly under the pressure. "You embarrassed me in there," he said finally, his voice low, not shouting, but sharper than glass underfoot. I turned my head toward the window and watched a hawker balancing a tray of boiled groundnuts on her head, her bare feet splashing in puddles as she moved from car to car. "I embarrassed myself, not you," I answered softly. My words hung in the space between us, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The traffic outside swelled with horns and shouts, Lagos moving as if nothing important had happened, yet my entire world had shifted. He began to speak again, his tone coaxing now, softer, the way you calm a restless child. "You're scared, I know. But think about the future. Think about us. Everyone makes sacrifices. This was supposed to be yours." I looked at him then, really looked, and I realized he was not asking for sacrifice, he was asking for surrender. I folded my arms across my chest and said nothing more, and when he saw my silence, he started the car, joining the line of vehicles crawling toward the main road. We drove in uneasy quiet, the sound of rain returning in thin drizzles against the windshield. The city outside was alive, shouting and bargaining and moving, while inside the car, the silence grew heavier, thicker, like smoke no wind could chase away. I pressed my palms together on my lap, and told myself that sometimes silence is the loudest refusal a person can give. That evening when we reached home, the flat felt like a stranger's house. George dropped his keys on the counter with a clatter that echoed longer than it should have, then paced the living room, his phone buzzing every few minutes. He picked it up each time, muttering into it in low tones, moving from English to pidgin when his frustration spilled over, words like reschedule, damage control, and don't send out the copy yet, drifting through the air like flies. I sat on the sofa, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea I hadn't finished, staring at the thin steam rising, letting its warmth travel into my palms, even though the drink had long grown cold. On the table near me lay the small box that carried my engagement ring, and I noticed how the light from the bulb above glinted off its smooth surface, almost accusingly. George hung up from another call, his face tight, and came to sit opposite me. His knees bounced, restless energy pouring out of him, and when he finally spoke, it was with a kind of desperation that I had not seen in him before. "Toria, you can't throw this away. We've invested so much. People are expecting. Do you understand what this looks like?" His words felt like sandpaper on my skin. I sipped my tea though it was tasteless, then set the mug down slowly, carefully, as if the act of putting it down might anchor me. "It looks like a woman deciding for herself," I said, my voice calm. He shook his head quickly, his hands gesturing as though he could shape my words into new meaning. "No, it looks like weakness. You don't want that reputation. People respect strength, perfection. That's what we're building. That's what they admire." I leaned back, my body sinking into the sofa, and studied him for a long while. He wasn't talking about love, not even about marriage. He was talking about image, about how the world saw him, about how I was another brick in the monument he wanted to build for himself. I felt suddenly tired, bone-deep tired, the kind of weariness that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something that was never yours to carry. "George," I whispered, "I am not a product." He opened his mouth to argue again, but I lifted my hand to stop him, and for the first time he actually fell silent. The quiet stretched between us, not comfortable, not easy, but necessary, like a bridge you know must be crossed no matter how shaky it feels. The days that followed moved strangely, half in shadow, half in light. George tried to return to his usual charm, buying flowers one morning, leaving notes on the table that said things like "let's fix this," and "we're stronger together." He called me during the day with that soothing tone he used when he wanted to erase conflict, as though words alone could plaster over cracks. But I had begun to see through the polish, and the shine no longer blinded me. Each time he spoke of us, I heard instead the echo of him with his friends, boasting, using me as the subject of a joke that was never meant for my ears. I went to work at the bookshop, and though I smiled at customers and recommended novels, inside me I was rearranging shelves of my own life, deciding what stayed and what must be removed. Mama Kofo noticed my quieter nature, but said nothing, her silence another kind of kindness. In the evenings, when I returned home, George would try to draw me into his world again. Dinners in places that smelled of polished wood and expensive perfumes, drives to Victoria Island where the lights glittered on the water. I followed him sometimes, but each time I felt more like an observer than a participant, like someone watching a film they had already guessed the ending of. One night, as we drove across Third Mainland Bridge, the lagoon stretching wide and dark beneath us, he said softly, "We can still make this work, Toria. We can still be perfect." His words echoed in the car, the word perfect lingering longer than the others, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. "I don't want perfect," I whispered, more to myself than to him. He looked at me sharply, as if I had spoken blasphemy. But it was the truth. Perfect had become a cage, and I was done decorating it. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window and watched the city lights blur, each one a reminder that life kept burning whether or not we dimmed ourselves for others. The final crack came quietly, without shouting or broken dishes, without slammed doors or dramatic exits. It came in the stillness of a morning when I woke before him, the sun just beginning to lift its head over the rooftops of Suralere, the bakery downstairs already pounding dough in its steady rhythm. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and sat by the window with my knees pulled up to my chest. The street outside was alive with ordinary sounds, women calling prices, radios playing high-life songs, children chasing each other barefoot, and I felt a strange peace settle in me. It was then I realized that peace was what I had been missing all along. George stirred awake, his voice still heavy with sleep, calling my name softly, then rising when he saw where I sat. He came toward me, his eyes pleading, his hand reaching. "Don't give up on us, Toria," he said. I looked at him for a long moment, then reached for the small box on the table. I held it in my palm, opened it gently, and saw the ring glinting there. My hand didn't shake as I set it down between us. I'm not giving up on us, I said quietly. I'm choosing myself. His face hardened, then softened, then hardened again, as though he couldn't decide which mask to wear. But I no longer waited for his expression to tell me my story. I rose, walked to the wardrobe, pulled out a small bag, and began to fold clothes into it. He didn't stop me. Perhaps he knew the tide had already turned. Perhaps he understood, finally, that control only works until someone finds their voice. By the time I stepped out into the street, bag over my shoulder, the air smelled of bread and wet dust, and the city greeted me with her usual noise. For the first time in a long while, the noise didn't drown me. It lifted me. I walked toward the bookshop, my steps lighter than they had been in months, my heart carrying the weight of freedom and nothing else. The days after I left George's flat unfolded like cloth slowly drying in the sun, each hour stretching long but carrying its own light. I returned to my mother's house in Port Harcourt first, the familiar smell of palm oil and wood smoke filling the rooms like a protective shield. She didn't ask many questions, not at first. She only looked at me with eyes that had weathered storms before, eyes that said she knew when a child was carrying more than her bag. I slept on the narrow bed I had used years ago, listening to the sound of rain tapping the zinc roof, and for the first time in months, I slept without fear of what I might wake up to. In the mornings, I helped her with her market stall, arranging peppers in neat pyramids, handing change to customers, laughing when a stubborn goat tried to eat our vegetables. Those small tasks stitched me back to myself. People in the neighborhood noticed my absence from Lagos and asked questions. I smiled and said, I needed rest. They nodded, because everyone understands rest even if they don't understand heartbreak. At night, I sat outside with my mother, fanning ourselves as the air grew heavy with humidity, and she told me in her quiet way that life was not meant to be polished smooth. Even yam, she said, has to keep some rough edges if you want it to taste like yam. I laughed, but the truth of her words settled in me like a stone in clear water. I thought of George then, his ambition, his obsession with perfect edges, and I realized how far I had drifted from the girl who once loved the sound of dough pounding at dawn. Slowly, the ache in my chest eased, replaced by something sturdier, the quiet knowledge that I had chosen myself. It was not victory in the grand way people expect, no trumpets, no applause, but it was mine. And sometimes, survival itself is the loudest triumph a person can claim. When I returned to Lagos after some weeks, the city greeted me with her usual noise, Danfo buses shouting destinations, vendors clapping bottle caps to get attention, the hot air thick with roasted maize and exhaust. But this time, I walked through it with lighter steps. I went back to the bookshop, and Mama Kofo hugged me without questions, her arms strong and smelling faintly of dust and soap. Welcome back, my dear, she said, handing me a biscuit as if no time had passed. The shelves were just as I left them, the books waiting patiently for hands to open them again, the radio in the corner still crackling with old songs. I settled into the rhythm easily, stacking novels, greeting customers, sharing recommendations. Each smile I gave was real now, not a mask to hide behind. I noticed things I had overlooked before. The way the afternoon light spilled through the windows, turning the covers golden. The way the bell on the door rang cheerfully for each new visitor. The way even silence in that shop had its own music. In the evenings, I returned to my flat above the bakery, the scent of bread rising like memory, the pigeons still squabbling on the balcony rail as if no time had passed. The flat felt different without George's presence, wider somehow, as if space itself had exhaled. I unpacked my bag slowly, folding clothes into drawers, placing small keepsakes on the shelf, reminding myself that this home was mine alone. The engagement ring stayed in its box, tucked away in the back of a drawer, not as a wound but as a lesson. Life outside carried on. The bakery boys shouted, the streets hummed with arguments and laughter, children ran noisily up the stairs, and through it all, I breathed without thinking of anyone watching. For the first time in a long time, my reflection in the mirror did not ask me questions I couldn't answer. It simply greeted me, plain and steady, and I greeted it back. George tried to reach me still, his calls buzzing my phone like persistent flies. At first, I ignored them, but eventually, I answered one. His voice was softer than I remembered, stripped of its usual shine. Toria, he said, we can try again. Forget the campaign, forget everything. Just come back. I listened quietly, my silence pressing against his words until he faltered. I thought I wanted perfect, he admitted, his voice breaking in a way that surprised me. But maybe I just wanted control. I closed my eyes, letting his words settle, and then I answered with a calm that surprised even me. George, I don't hate you, but I can't return to a place where I was never enough as myself. You wanted someone polished. I'm not that. I'm me. There was a long pause, the line filled with the hum of distant traffic, before he finally said, I'll always regret losing you. His voice carried sincerity, but regret is not the same as love, and I had learned that lesson the hard way. Take care of yourself, I whispered and ended the call. After that, his messages grew fewer, until they stopped altogether. The silence he left behind was not empty. It was space, wide and open, space for me to grow without being measured. One evening, walking back from the bookshop, I passed a billboard near the main road. It bore the image of a woman smiling, flawless skin, perfect features, the tagline below reading, Love Improved. I paused and stared at it for a moment, then smiled faintly. The words no longer stung. They felt hollow, like an echo from a place I had left behind. I kept walking, the sound of the city folding around me, each step proof that I had chosen a different kind of love, the kind that begins and ends with oneself. Months later, Lagos hosted its annual Lantern Festival by the lagoon, a night when the city softened, and people carried light in their hands instead of on their tongues. I joined the crowd, holding a paper lantern, its flame flickering gently in the evening breeze. Families gathered, children laughed, lovers whispered to each other as the water reflected hundreds of small floating stars. I stood near the edge, watching lanterns drift across the lagoon like tiny boats carrying wishes. The air smelled of roasted suya and fried akra, voices blending into a gentle hum that felt almost holy. As I lifted my lantern, a little girl nearby tugged her mother's wrapper and asked, Mummy, am I pretty enough to be on the big screen? The mother hushed her, but the girl's eyes turned to me, curious, hopeful. I knelt beside her, the lantern warm in my hands, and said softly, Screens don't decide beauty. You're already enough. Remember that. Her smile lit up brighter than the lanterns floating away. I stood, released mine into the air, and watched it rise slowly, carried upward by the night. My heart rose with it, lighter than it had been in years. The lagoon shimmered, the city glowed, and I felt the kind of peace that doesn't need applause to exist. Later that night, back in my flat, I looked into the mirror. No cracks, no filters, no angles chosen by someone else. Just me. My voice filled the quiet room as I whispered, Hello, Toria. I'm here. And for the first time, I truly believed those words. The story had begun on an operating table under harsh lights, but it ended here, in soft light, in silence that was mine, with a woman who had chosen to fight for herself and won. This story teaches us something simple but powerful. Never let anyone define your worth. You are not a project to be polished. You are not clay for others to reshape. You are already enough with your scars, your laughter, your mistakes, and your victories. Anyone who truly loves you will love you as you are, not as they imagine you should be. So hold on to yourself, because losing yourself for someone else's approval is the deepest kind of loss. May your life be filled with peace that no hand can steal. May your heart never bow to those who only love perfection. May you find strength to walk away from anything that reduces you. May joy flow into your days like rivers that never run dry. May your scars turn to stories of victory, and your tears to testimonies of grace. And may you always be surrounded by people who see your light and never try to dim it. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.